Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Cousins. Marko and I are both on the road, but we made some time in the evening on Tuesday, October 14th to talk to you before we were dealing with our respective responsibilities. We talk about the Gen Z protests, some interesting curveballs in there, but of course, U.S. China relations, trade, everything else. We hope you enjoy the episode. If you want to do us a favor, please share this podcast with everybody that you know. That's all you have to do. Spread it far and wide. Cheers and see you out there. All right, listeners, cousins, back at it. I cut Marko off because he was starting to make basketball jokes. Marko, I'm in Milwaukee. You're in Phoenix. What does that have to do with basketball?
Well, I was just saying that both cities have something in common, which is that they're going nowhere when it comes to the NBA. So.
Phoenix probably not. It's really, it's amazing how fast Phoenix fell from grace and how different the narrative would be if they had beat Giannis in that finals and CP3 had gotten his finals and quite a sliding doors moment.
Also DeAndre Ayton. I mean, that was his last relevant season. But look, we can't lead with basketball. We're going to lose a lot of our listeners. We obviously have to leave that for the end. I do have some questions for you at the end, though. For you and our listeners on the basketball front, but
obviously we have to lead with Ryan Russillo breaking up with Bill Simmons officially and moving to Barstool Sports, right? That's what you're implying?
Yeah, that was actually very surprising, but I guess that's what happens when you don't give people equity. Good people leave when you don't give them enough or at all any equity. So I don't know, you sent me or you posted the video of Ryan Russillo basically saying why, and it was very clear that he emphasized, that it was all about being a partner. He wants to be partner at this stage in his career.
Number one, for somebody who's been on the radio and podcasts and TV for as long as he was so painfully awkward in that video, which is one of the reasons I like him because he just sucks at these things. He also deigned to use the words "at this stage in my career," which I don't know, how many people has he probably criticized as well from that point of view. But I'm going to make this vow to you in front of all the listeners, Marko. I will never leave you for David Portnoy. Now, Mr. Portnoy, if you're listening and you want to bring both of us to the Barstool Geopolitics Network, we are both going to talk, but you will not divide my loyalties.
But the reason I'm not Bill Simmons is because we're equal partners.
Yes.
In this endeavor, right? So that is the difference. I mean, and by the way, that's, I think, what's very important for anyone starting a business. You cannot keep people who are critical to the business or who are clearly a generational talent without sharing equity with them. That's just they're going to leave. You know what I mean? And it's a free market, baby. Once you reach a certain level of excellence, and Ryan Russillo is excellent. And so he bounced.
All right. Well, also just the last bit of foreplay before we get into it. I don't drink a whole lot these days, mostly because was up with the 10-month-old all night last night. It's just a lot. But I will say when I'm in Wisconsin, I cannot help but drink some of the Spotted Cow here. Only available in Wisconsin. It's a delicious beer. They drink more per capita in Wisconsin than anywhere else in the United States. I felt like I should join in. So I'm having a beer with you this evening too, Mark.
That's awesome. I'm actually on coffee because I've been on client calls since 5 a.m. Also, a couple of things. Since we are partners, don't do that again unless they pay us. Can we just make sure?
I've been adding them to come on the podcast for some time, but yes, okay, fine.
And second of all, I love you, but you sometimes say things that are completely illogical. You drink because you have a 10-month-old. That's why you would drink.
Oh, I see.
You see what I mean?
Saying. Well, yeah, but if you're using alcohol as a crutch to deal with, your feelings of
parenting,
stress.
yes. Go on. You're going to lose everyone listening to this podcast. Let's just move on.
Marko, I lost them a long time ago. Remember, I'm the elitist here in the conversation. My job is not to make these people happy. That's
fair enough.
Anyway, okay, but the thing that probably everybody wants to talk about, I'll try and set us up here well, Marko. So we've got fireworks in the U.S. China trade relationship. We've got some other things we want to get to in the episode today, but we should talk about them. It began. Well, it depends where you think it begins. Sort of depends, because there was this ruling last week. The Department of Commerce had this new 50% rule that entities that are owned 50% by a foreign government or some entity that is on an entity list. That would trigger a bunch of different export controls. That at least is what people are pointed to as the reason for China reacting pretty disproportionately and announcing a bunch of export controls on rare earth elements. This is the part in the conversation where we have to remind listeners that rare earth elements are not rare. They are just incredibly costly and pollutive to mine effectively, and China doesn't care about any of that. They got rid of all the regulations, and they have become the real center of a lot of these of mining and processing and refining a lot of these different rare earths. A lot of these are minerals and resources whose names I can't even pronounce, but I know that they're incredibly important in semiconductors, in electricity management devices like capacitors. I mean, there's all sorts of things that they're absolutely mission critical for, and which China controls massive amounts of the supply chain for. And China, it's not necessarily banning the exports of lots of these different minerals. What it's doing, though, is it's going to make Chinese companies and Chinese exporters have to apply for approval to continue exporting in the future. I thought one of the interesting things, too, is it's not just the heavy rare earth elements and the graphite and the anode, all that other stuff. They also put at least quote unquote restrictions on any technologies that lead to the assembly, maintenance, repair, and upgrading of production line for rare earth mining. So I think they're looking there and saying, okay, these other countries in the world want to do this. They want to take some of this processing and refining back. We're not going to let you do that either, because we have cornered the market on this, and we're the ones that have all the technology and the refining, processing, and capacity as well. There's also, and this is just in the last couple of days, like everybody's focusing on the rare earths, but I don't know if you saw this, Marko. There's also a return to these tit-for-tat port fees that ocean shipping firms are going to be charging on each other. This was something that both the United States and China announced earlier in the year when President Trump was talking about 240% tariffs. They were supposed to kick in later. Were they going to get kicked in at all? It appears that they're being kicked in. Now, both China and the United States tried to assuage investors and say, it's not going to be that big of a deal. But China also said it has started to collect charges on U.S.-owned, operated, built, or flagged vessels. And the United States has similar restrictions in place at its different ports. I talked to different folks in the shipping industry. They don't even really know what the rules are at this point and how they're going to be enforced. China also added some subsidiaries of a South Korean shipbuilding company on its sanctions list for engaging with the United States, which is an interesting thing. And before I turn it over to you to let you give us a take on this, I did just want to quote the President of the United States. By the way, Scott Bessent said that President Trump and Xi Jinping will still meet in a couple of weeks and that he thinks these things can be de-escalated. So that to me probably says short-term deal, but we won't step on the punchline. But here's what the President of the United States had to say when he was asked about Beijing pursuing these new curbs on rare earth element exports. Quote, "We have the ultimate export. We have import and we have export. We import from China massive amounts. And maybe we'll have to stop doing that, but I don't know exactly what it is. Neither do you, neither does anybody." End quote. I also loved the next line in the Bloomberg article that had this quote. It was unclear what exports the president was referring to. Marko, what is going on in the U.S. China relationship?
Oh man. Well, first of all, one of the reasons that I love that you set up our conversations is that you do such a thorough job of explaining what happened. Because I would say no, seriously, and I'm just saying that because most of the media kind of missed that October 2nd semiconductor round of export controls. So the United States of America has tried to close the loophole. Basically, the U.S. does not want entities in China that are aligned in some way, shape, or form, pretty loosely, I would say. The Donald Trump administration was very narrow in its definition of what Chinese entities are aligned with the military and the Communist Party. They needed to see direct ownership link. The Biden administration broadened the connection massively, too massively, I would say, because if you sell toilet paper to the Chinese, like People's Liberation Army, you are effectively like part of the military-industrial complex. So that's Joe Biden and his administration's fault. But what Trump has done is he's continued the Joe Biden line, And then he's closed the loophole whereas many of these Chinese companies would create a subsidiary, they would create another company, own a piece of it, and then have that subsidiary just buy the chips. And so on October 2nd, the Trump administration tried to close that loophole with what's called the 50% rule. If various listed entities of the Chinese government that Chinese government has some sort of relationship with, if they control effectively over 50%, you're not supposed to do these trips. You're not. So the first foray this time around was again launched by the U.S. Your assessment is correct that October 2nd was important, but then you also said that China reacted disproportionately, and I would actually argue that it reacted extremely proportionately. So as the Chinese, I think it was Commerce Ministry or someone like that, their statement on Saturday, after the Friday tweet for President Trump that he was going to put sanctions at 100%, their statement went along something like, look, and this was not carried by a lot of the Western press because it doesn't fit the neat narrative that the Chinese are losing their cool. But the Chinese Commerce Ministry came out and said, look, these are export controls. They're not export bans. And all legitimate businesses have nothing to worry about. It was almost verbatim, something like that. In other words, like, hey, look, I mean, the U.S. is imposing export controls where they want to go purchase order by purchase order and approve each one. Well, we want to have that sort of Damocles over your heads too. We're not saying that you're not going to get the rare earths from China. And everyone listening to this, just to be clear, none of this is about banning. Like America will still sell semiconductors, but it has to go to companies in China that are allowed to buy it. And China's simply saying, we're not banning rare earths, but similarly, we're going to say to Lockheed Martin, like, hey, dual use technology, you're building missiles that one day might kill Chinese. We're not going to sell you rare earths, but we'll sell it to NVIDIA. And so I think that that's an important point. I think this is extremely proportionate, as is the shipping fees that you also mentioned. China's saying to the U.S., we're just going to do tit for tat. So I think that that's something to understand. I don't think there's a real shift in Chinese thinking here. I think that they're just finally starting to say to America, like, look, we are going to start restricting access to rare earths if you restrict access to semiconductors. On tariffs, we're not going to follow you. We're not going to keep ratcheting tariffs. And they actually said that after April, they came out and said it's nonsense to keep increasing tariffs. They made a joke, like Beijing made a joke about this.
Yeah,
like
it was good. It was because it was so
what was
unexpected. It really hit. Well, I could try to find the exact language, but it was when Trump did 240% tariffs, and they did something like, okay, like this doesn't mean anything after 120%, so we're just going to stop at 120%, like whatever.
1 billion%. No, so I basically think, look, the Chinese are saying like, you do something on October 2nd, we do something on October 8th. And then Friday rolls along, and Donald Trump reacts, loses his cool. And he's like, this is nuts. And then 24 hours later, he's like, ha, psych, I was just kidding. Everything is going to be fine. So what happened here? I'll tell you what I think happened, Jacob. I think there's two tracks in American foreign policy right now. There's a sort of a bureaucratic inertia. And if you think about how bureaucracy works, there's like a lever. There's like a toggle. And the toggle is like from 1 to 10. 1 being like, let's be nice to China. 10 being, time to fuel up the nukes and nuke China. And so obviously since 2017, Donald Trump himself moved the toggle from 1 to 6. And then interestingly, Joe Biden moved it from 6 to 8. Mm-hmm. And so that's just the default setting of the bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy continues to initiate Section 301 investigations on China, which take months to get done. There's a bureaucratic and technocratic process in these investigations. There's serious people who get paid good money, who are well educated, who are working on all these, we need to close the loophole because of these subsidiaries. Let's do that. And that's one layer of the cake. And then there's the icing, which is very orange and very, very like profoundly awesome. And that's Donald Trump. And he does not have any, I think, awareness of what his own bureaucracy is doing on those other layers. And so when China retaliates against something that, the United States of America did, like his administration did, he's like, whoa, Xi Jinping made a mistake. But, well, no, he's just reacting to what your government is doing. And then he realizes it, and then he calms down 24 hours later. He probably has a Snicker bar, right? Like the famous Snicker commercial. And he says, oh, okay, I see what happened here. And as, of course, Donald Trump said a couple of months ago, or maybe even a couple of weeks ago, look, American chip companies will sell chips to China. They want to sell chips to China. He wants them to sell chips to China so they can continue to have a monopoly. And so I think that where this is headed is Donald Trump, who wants a deal with China and understands that there are downsides to some of these export controls in a genuine way, not in sort of a silly Donald Trump just wants to make a deal way, but there's actual downside to effectively helping China develop its own chip industry. That's what America is doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what you're going to see is Donald Trump is going to win over that lower layer, where he's just going to tell the bureaucracy, like, look, let's find a compromise here. And so, yes, I do think there's going to be a deal. And it's not just Scott Bessent. Jameson Greer came out also with very sort of conciliatory comments like, oh, no, we're gonna sit down with the Chinese. And I would say that this is where the TikTok deal is also important, because speaking to people with contacts in China itself, what I've been told from my onshore contacts is that the TikTok deal actually allowed a creation of, it wasn't that relevant as a deal. Like nobody's really like sitting here like wondering where TikTok is going. But what it did is it created sinews and connectivity at very top. And so there's finally channels of communication, whereas there weren't really in April when President Trump just went on a tariff tirade. After the TikTok deal was settled, even though the deal itself was not that important, the mechanism to get the deal done means that people in power in both China and US have a way to text each other, have a way to call each other, have a way to be like, yo, why are you restricting rare earths? Well, because you guys just a week earlier restricted semiconductors. No, we didn't. Yeah, you did. What about this? Oh, no, that's just standard stuff we're doing because you guys are rivals. Well, now we're going to respond. And then you have that conversation, and it's not just two megaphones shouting into the ether. So I think that's the background of this story, and I don't think we're going to end up with 100% tariffs on toys for Christmas.
No, and if we do, I mean, things are going to be terrible. There's a couple things to say in there. You're right that the Biden administration was much tougher and much more surgical on Beijing. And you might remember the Biden administration, one of their last gasp acts was this semiconductor restriction plan. It was basically some countries have no restrictions, some have some level of restriction, then there's the ultimate level of restriction, and China was going to be on that list. The Trump administration threw that plan out months ago now, saying we are going to have something that we're going to put in its place. We still don't know what that thing is in its place. And in the meantime, we've had, for example, NVIDIA lobby against some of the restrictions that it was dealing with, and then the Trump administration saying that it was going to take a cut of exports going to China, which is also an interesting sort of part of this. There's also, I don't know if this is still true, but when China first started making noise about this, and they've been doing this for years, like these export controls on some of these different elements and mineral resources. Yes, it is that they want to be able to control this with the West and control the processing. But China, again, I'll just remind our listeners, is a country of 1 billion people, and the Chinese government doesn't always know what its own companies are doing. So part of the process of getting Chinese companies to apply for approval to export these things, yes, it was to create a lever with the West, but it was also for the Chinese government to figure out what the fuck they had going on, because they didn't even know what kind of levers they were pulling. I think they have a better sense of those levers now,
yes,
but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little bit of that in there. There's also, oh yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish.
Well, the last thing I just want to say is, I talked to a guy who's in the rare earth refining processing space and who was trying to basically bring that to the United States. And I was asking him, well, I texted him today and I was like, you must be having an interesting week. And he said, yeah, I am having an interesting week. And I asked him, is it anything more than talk? And his answer was basically not really. People are freaking out, they're saying lots of things in public, but the shift from, hey, this is a problem, to no, we're actually going to spend the money to have CapEx, to refine and process these things. And countries that are the United States, are friendly to the United States, I don't think we're exactly there yet. And he expects some kind of short-term deal as well. All of which is to say, and I think you and I have both been on this from different angles from the very beginning, which is Trump's instinct, I think, is to make a deal with China, much to the chagrin of Peter Navarro and the other China hawks that he has in his administration. And people like Jameson Greer and Scott Bessent are cool with that. And I think if it was up to Trump, like he would announce some deal and there would be a grand U.S. China bargain and everything would be fine. The flip side of that is that some of the things that his government is doing and some of the things that he says
Right.
is the exact opposite, which is full decoupling. Like there's not going to be any future in the U.S.-China relationship. These are geopolitical rivals. And I don't even think Trump, like there's no consistency with him. And I think the Chinese have at least realized that. And so they have to punch the bully in the mouth when the bully comes at them with something like the 50% rule. But they also ultimately have economic problems of their own. And if they can have a short-term deal whose provisions they won't live up to, like so for any investors or folks who have companies, you should behave as if there is no deal. Because I'll put my neck out there and say, in 5 years, it doesn't matter. Like the U.S. and
Right.
China are decoupling. Like it doesn't matter if we have some kind of short-term deal or whatever else is happening. But anyway, just go from there.
Cool. Okay. So we have some disagreements,
Great.
which is good. So first of all, I think the onshore narrative in China, like if you were to spend some time reading op-eds in Mandarin in China, which I don't, but I'm told what they are, is effectively there's no urgency for anything. There is no urgency to even punch the bully in the mouth, although I agree with you, they did. They finally kind of did something. But there's no urgency, and that's why the comments on Saturday was so conciliatory. They were like, hey guys, this isn't export bans. We're not banning export of rare earths. Relax. The issue is they do want a deal, and the reason is that the onshore commentary, if you were reading like the equivalent of a New York Times op-ed in China, the consensus in China is the United States of America is going to collapse into a black hole of civil war, demographic decline, racial tensions, and complete collapse.
Yeah. Late stage capitalism. The Marxists were right.
Yeah. So what's the rush? There's no rush. You know, like let's make a deal with Trump. And I think that everyone in China completely understands something that I was saying on this podcast like a year, like when we started and before that on your podcast. Trump will make a deal with China. I said this in February of 2024. Like I've consistently like Trump is not a national security hawk. You don't put Tulsi Gabbard as the head of your, you know, national security if you're a national security hawk. He's not. He is mercantilist. And I actually think where we disagree a little bit is I actually think that his approach is the more optimal approach. Because in a multipolar world, it doesn't pay to decouple. And I think the big risk for the US is that by restricting export of American technology, often a couple of generations late, you will incentivize China to become very good at its own technology, alternative technologies that you have no input into. But anyways, what I want to like really emphasize here is that I think that the Chinese are perfectly fine. They understand that this is a limited window where maybe they have somebody who's a little bit different from what's coming. You know, whether it's JD Vance or AOC, I can see a world in which whoever inherits the presidency after President Trump is much tougher on China and adopts the Jake Sullivan, Joe Biden approach. But they're cool with that because they just don't really think they're in a rush because America's collapsing. And that narrative of American collapse is almost like a really good thing for the world because it means that China's not going to do something stupid. And if I was advising President Xi, I would say that that narrative is, you know, while very pleasing to read, I'm sure, in those New York Times equivalent op-eds in China, you're kind of reading what's very pleasing to you. You know, it's sort of like a liberal reading a Guardian op-ed, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not reading that version of the commentary in Chinese, but my sense is more that it's in the same way that that any average student in the United States is taught that the United States is a beacon of liberalism and individual rights, and that the United States stands up for these things. Like China, like Xi Jinping himself was educated in a Marxist framework, and he thinks of the world through a Marxist point of view. So I don't know that they're thinking that it's going to be civil war and carnage in the streets. My interpretation of the intelligentsia in China has always just been more, like this is late stage capitalism. Okay, like Marx was a little bit later than he should have been, but like eventually this system is not going to work in the long term. And meanwhile, like we have socialism with Chinese characteristics and everything. It seems a little more sober.
I think it's gone. I think it's more than that. I think now it's about technological
Yeah,
superiority of China.
that's
I
fair.
think there's and I think like deployment of look. I mean, if you grew up in an authoritarian state, when you see the military deployed to cities, like what that means in a Chinese context. But there's another thing I want to disagree with you on. Well, this wasn't really a disagreement. This was just an intro to the
Yeah.
real disagreement. And my real disagreement is I think that decoupling is impossible. And let me explain why I say that. The one our our actual example of decoupling in a modern industrial world, n equals 1. Our sample size is 1, and that's the Cold War. And I really, really, really want to emphasize how ahistorical and idiosyncratic and path dependent the Cold War was. In 1945, I know I've said this before on our podcast, but I just want to emphasize in 1945, the world was destroyed. Like it was destroyed, you know? It looked like Gaza. It
It,
did.
it, it, it looks better than Gaza. Hmm.
Large swaths of the
Large
developed
swaths,
world
yes.
looked worse than Gaza.
No, well, no, because not like even Germany didn't look that bad because
Oh my
like
God. Okay, we don't have to get into commentary on what Gaza looks like. I retract that.
I win. I win. You get that? See
You
that?
do. You win. Look, the point is that the world was completely destroyed. Like, let me emphasize the destruction. There were tens of millions of refugees starving in Western Europe. Not like in Eastern Germany. Like I'm talking like the western side of Europe, like in Belgium. People were starving to death in freaking Brussels. Japan had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on it, and multiple cities completely firebombed into like even worse destruction level. Like if you got hit with a nuke, you were lucky.
Yeah.
You escaped the firebombing.
And
China would have.
China went straight to civil war. They were like, "Oh, World
I
War
was
II's
just gonna say
over.
that
Like, let's get to it."
they had another 4 years of civil war. India was a colony of a tired, weakened empire. And then you have, of course, Soviet Union, which is just a complete mess. I mean, they eked out that win by the skin of their teeth. Only really the United States of America and some parts of Soviet Union still have an industrial plant. And so what I'm getting at is that when the Cold War starts, you have large parts of the planet are tabula rasa, completely erased, which is a fancy way of saying blank plate. And so you can craft a material reality, an industrial world that truly is decoupled because you're starting with large swaths of the planet completely unintegrated or destroyed. And so if the Soviets want to have their technological zone that's clearly decoupled from the US, they can, and vice versa. Now notice that that's how Cold War started. That was the starting conditions of the Cold War. World War One, however, and World War II started in a completely different world. They actually started in a globalized world. So my favorite historian, Margaret Macmillan, she wrote all these books about First World War. She really talks about this in a great way. Like when World War One starts, there are literally munitions companies that are like building sea mines that are like 30% owned by a German conglomerate and
Yeah.
40% owned by British. So the board meets when the war starts, and the board is like high-fiving. The Germans and the Brits are high-fiving. Holy shit, we're going to war.
Well, yeah, the munitions ones were the British insurance companies that were insuring German ships were not high fiving. They were looking
They're
at
not high-fiving.
themselves and being like, "What the
But
hell
you
are
know
we
what I
gonna
mean?
do?"
There's a German guy and a British guy saying like, yo, we're going to make money. I'll see you in 6 months. I'm sorry about what's going to happen. It's going to be fine. We'll back by Christmas. Everything is good. The point is that the world was so integrated in 1914. And don't you make the mistake, and I don't mean you, Jacob, but don't you make the mistake, dear listener, to think that the World War I somehow crept up on us. That's what everybody always says. Oh, but they didn't. No, they knew. They knew from mid 1890s. Everybody knew that Germany and Austria would go to war with France, Russia, and the UK in some combination, shape, or form. Everybody knew. Everybody was looking forward to it. And yet they couldn't disentangle this technological reality. And now that's a world where I actually think I can see maybe an argument being made. Yeah, but technology back then was difficult to entangle. What are you talking about? Our levers, our tools, our components were huge. Widgets and, giant things that rotate. Today, it's so much more difficult to disentangle when the components are like rare earths you don't even know how to pronounce. And neither do I. Let me be very clear. And so I would say that the problem for the world today is that we had 25 years, if not 35 years, of genuine peace and prosperity in a unipolar global system that America designed. They became deeply intertwined. And so full decoupling is probably never going to happen. However, I do believe that there will be technological decoupling in certain ways, but that's nothing to fear. I mean, I grew up in communist Yugoslavia. Jacob, you grew up in, pillar of liberty and freedom in America.
Yeah.
And if you were to send, if a 12-year-old Jacob was going to send, a 14-year-old Marko a tape of Atlanta Hawks with Dominique, having their day in the sun, if you were going to send that to me.
I have to date myself. I unfortunately just missed the Dominique era. I came of age during the Mookie Blaylock, Steve Smith.
Listen, I love that team. Mookie Blaylock was one of my favorite players. By the way, curiously looked almost exactly like Michael Jordan, almost like they were brothers.
Yeah, like a little mini me. Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so like if you were to send me a VHS tape, guess what? It wouldn't work. And poor Marko, trapped in communist Yugoslavia, would have not been able to play that VHS tape because I was in a different technological system than you. Similarly, when cell phones started, when I moved from Europe to pursue my undergraduate degree in Canada, guess what? My cell phone didn't work. I had to get a tri-band. It's okay. There will be some technological decoupling. And I hear a lot of investment banks and commentators talking about how that will cause the world to go on two different. No, it won't. All it will do is it will lead to entrepreneurs building systems that can read both technological, both technological pillars, which is exactly what happened with phones. Nokia came up with a tri-band phone that did work in both Japan and North America and Europe. And yes, there were VHS players. There were literally, they could flip between PAL SECOM and NTSC. That's how old I am. I know that stuff. So the point is, somebody's going to figure this out, just like we had in early desktop computers. You're on the Mac system, I'm on the Microsoft system. Eventually, yes, you could read the files from one system to another. And now we're seamlessly integrated. So I think that we're overstating the decoupling massively. I don't think the decoupling is really what we should be thinking about. I think if World War III starts, Jacob, it's going to start with both countries being very deeply integrated. And I think Donald Trump, to his credit, has figured that out. I think he has figured out that it's very difficult to completely decouple, and that not only is it difficult, it's stupid. It means that American companies cannot make money off of China, the second largest economy in the world, which is objectively a mistake.
I love how optimistic you were in that. That was really I like it. You're right. I do disagree with you. I'm going to quote the guy who's figured this out. Again, quote, "We have the ultimate export. We have import and we have export. We import from China massive amounts. And maybe we'll have to stop doing that. But I don't know exactly what it is. Neither do you. Neither does anybody." This is not a guy who knows what he's talking about, Marko. You're giving him way too much credit that he's figured something out.
I think his gut is in the right place, man. And the fact, listen,
he has a wonderful sense of where power is, and when it comes to trade, the United States has certain levers that it is far and away better than China on, okay? But a lot of them, it's China. I say this a lot in my presentations right now. I put up a picture of William McKinley, and I ask audiences, do you know who this guy is? And literally 1% of audiences know who it is. And I say, this is William McKinley. He literally referred to himself as a quote-unquote tariff man. And Donald Trump loves to talk about him all the time. And he imposed tariffs across the board. And when he imposed tariffs across the board, which were good for the U.S. economy in that pre-World War I world that you're talking about. By the way, I hope you don't turn into the Norman Angle of globalization, like the Great Illusion, because you're flirting with it a little bit. When William McKinley did that, the United States was making something like 30% of the manufactured products that were in the world, and the Brits had another 20%.
Right.
The Chinese and the Japanese weren't doing any of that. The Japanese were just starting to rev up. The Chinese were a morass. India was getting dominated, by a couple thousand British soldiers. and everything else. You flip that to today, China wins. China wins on ships. It wins on active pharmaceutical ingredients. I guess we're not going to have Tylenol in this country anymore, but if you did want Tylenol for your kid with an ear infection, like probably the API is coming either from India or China. Agricultural machinery, you start going down the list of things that the United States is
But doesn't that
dependent
prove
on
my
China
point?
for.
But doesn't
It
that prove my
does.
point?
It does. It does prove your point today, and I think they are deeply interconnected. And I think any person who wants to fight a trade war with China and then is the one who is responsible for what happens afterwards, like maybe President Trump, the first administration was a little bit more muscular, and he loves to go after China on the campaign trail. But when he's the one sitting in the White House and he's looking at the inflation numbers and he's looking at all the things that cannot be manufactured in the United States, all the things, by the way, that he pushed to be manufactured in the United States during his first term, in which we are no closer to manufacturing in the United States than we were in the first
I think
term.
you're over-indexing on my point that Trump has a good gut. What you should be over-indexing is that you just laid the case for why there's no way we're going to decouple. And it's not Donald Trump who's confused, it's Joe Biden who was confused. And Jake Sullivan.
Yeah, I mean that's Joe Biden's confused. That's a low. Yes, Joe Biden was confused and is confused.
Let me just explain what I mean by the statement. Like I'm not trying to make a domestic political point. I'm just saying that Donald Trump, I never took him seriously when he did impose the tariffs at 800% on China. I think that Donald Trump was always going to make a deal with China. He went on the campaign trail saying he was cool with BYD building factories in Ohio because it's smart. It's fixed asset investment that America can nationalize in case of a war. Of course, you should let China build BYD factories. And Donald Trump had the balls to say that in front of a crowd full of potential manufacturing blue-collar laborers who aren't going to work in there because of automation. But this isn't about whether Donald Trump is right or not. I just never took him seriously when he's aggressive on China because I take him seriously that he wants to make this deal because of everything you just said. And you laid out a plethora of evidence why it's really difficult to decouple. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Well, and I think you were exactly right earlier, by the way, when you said that President Trump doesn't always know what his bureaucracy is doing. And by the way, that's true of any executive. Like bureaucracies are machines and they're Frankensteins. They have lives of their own. And a good executive has to come in and rein them back in because like that's what happens with bureaucracy. But that said, I would say most of the bureaucracy is aligned against President Trump, and public opinion is aligned against President Trump. And the interesting thing about Trump is he rode what you're talking. Like I agree with you that that's what he wants to do, but also part of the reason he got elected the first time was because he talked about China in a way that was way more serious than anybody else did. So he's got this anti-China thing. And the other thing, and I'll let you cook in a second. I just want to say I think we actually do agree, and I laid out that case. The only thing I want to say back to you is I completely agree with you that it is irrational and asinine and crazy for the United States to try and decouple from China. It would be disastrous. That does not mean it won't happen. It is totally irrational. It does not make any sense. But this is where geopolitics falls off the rails, because sometimes actors do irrational things for reasons that are hard for rational cousins to divine.
Well, so first of all, I definitely took offense to the Norman Angle reference. For those of you who don't know, it's a very deep cut. Just to repeat my point, my view is that when World War III starts, it may very well start, and that's what Norman Angle was wrong about. Right? He thought that the level of interconnectedness would prevent a war. I'm not saying that we are in a world where. I'm just saying like World War III will start maybe 10 years from now. We will remain connected with China, and I believe that because of the 50 years of Cold War. Most human beings listening to this podcast want to light themselves on fire. Their brains blow up. They cannot process mentally the words that are coming out of my mouth. And the words that are coming out of my mouth is what empirics and game theory proves, which is that in a multipolar world order, enemies trade with one another. Sorry, end of sentence. That's it. So yeah, war can still happen, but it will happen at a very high level of economic integration because it's just so difficult to disentangle, namely because your own allies steal market share from you by trading with the enemy. That's the whole point. Like, it's difficult, and that's what Trump tried to do, and quite frankly, he's given up because the rest of the world is like, no, sorry, we're going to trade with China. Now, like Europe is imposing tariffs on China, but they're going to make a deal separate from the U.S. Now there's a BYD factory coming into Spain, and what did they ask? They asked for IP. Boom.
Yeah, that's
You know,
true. But one thing I forgot to do in my intro was, did you see that thing that the Dutch did with this
yes.
company
Yeah,
called
okay.
Nexperia, where they're basically seizing a Chinese
We all
semiconductor?
know why the Dutch are doing that.
Why?
You know what I'm going to say.
I
The
know what you're
Dutch are
gonna say,
doing that. The Dutch are doing that so that they can shower themselves with money selling ASML machines to China,
yeah, which
right?
the
So,
United States does not want them to do. To your point.
but they've done it. Even with Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden, nobody cares in there. Let's say, why should they? Listen. At some level, it's very simple, and I've said this before on this podcast. France and Netherlands, they're going to tell America, listen, bro. World War III starts, we're dying with you in the trenches against the Chinese. But until that moment, you know, Emmanuel has to sell them Airbuses, and I got to sell them ASML machines. Why? Because we need the money to develop cruise missiles with which to help you fight the Chinese. Are you going to give us that money? Are you going to buy Airbuses instead of Boeings so that France has enough money to remain a viable
No,
ally?
JD Vance wants them to use that money to turn around and buy American defense products,
Well,
of
and
course.
that's and this is where this all kind of breaks apart. But one thing I want to say is that um, one last thing I want to disagree with you on, and I know we got to pivot to X, but this is great. This is a good discussion. The last thing I want to say is, like you said, the bureaucracy is against Trump and China. You're 150% right. So the national intelligence, defense community, all of course against China. I mean, they know what butters their bread, and it ain't world peace, buddy.
Nope.
So bureaucracy, and yes, I think there's a lot of vested interest against the narrative that it's impossible to decouple. But I do disagree with you on the people. And I have a chart that maybe we can put in the show notes, but it
Hmm.
shows something fascinating, Jacob. It's one of the most fascinating charts. It's an Ipsos poll done with, I think, the Chicago Council. And it shows that in 2016, about 30% of Americans, 30% Republicans, 40% of Democrats, agreed with the statement that trade leads to jobs in America.
Hmm.
So, your point is correct. In 2016, voters wanted a trade war with China because they felt that the trade was unfair. And President Trump beat Hillary Clinton as a result of it. I really believe that. And he delivered it. He satiated the demand that the American public had in 2016. But since then, you know what the current level is?
No, what is it?
Republican support is at about 65%, Democratic is 75%. And I would say that it's thanks to Donald Trump. Donald Trump delivered what the median voter wanted in 2016. What he and his administration seems to be unaware of is that they should be patting themselves on the back for what they delivered in 2017 and 18 instead of tripling down on policy that nobody in this country wants. And I have so much data. I have a cornucopia of charts, Jacob, that proves my points. Tariffs and trade are the least important political issue in the United States of America. Behind like abortion, nobody cares about this stuff. And he's completely over indexing on it, not knowing that what he should be doing is claiming victory for delivering fair trade because clearly American voters are now far more, they've doubled their support for globalization. That's surprising, no?
It, it is a little surprising, but it also, if you pull the data on what Americans' perceptions of China were in 2016 and 2017, and I haven't looked at the data in the last year or two, I doubt it's changed that much. But in 2016, 2017, old people hated China because it was communist China, part of the Cold War, everything else. But young Chinese people, generally speaking, were interested in and liked Americans, and the same was true. And over the course of the first Trump administration and the Biden administration, that changed, where both youths on both sides now distrust each other at the same level that the old guys from the Cold War do. So I think you're right that you can point to data that shows that about globalization, but I think you can also point to data that the average median voter in the United States is animated by a deep set fear of China. And then if you give them policies and they have to fight between their support of globalization or whatever else, or even their cheap products at the Dollar General versus let's stick it to China, for some, the fear thing will pop up, and for some, the other thing will pop up. And I think the
I think
fear
for a
was
vast
probably
majority, I'll just make a call right now. I think for the vast majority, it will be economics over foreign policy because foreign policy is, again, completely and utterly irrelevant to most Americans. I mean, sorry, I'm not saying that out of my ass. I'm again relying on polls. So yes, I think what you are revealing is exactly evidence again for my view, which is that eventually, when World War III starts, because young people hate each other, fine, you're right. it will do so at a very high level of economic integration.
Yeah.
Because nobody, like, you're right, like, clearly, sentiment towards China has soured, but that sentiment towards China as an enemy, as a rival, economic sentiment towards globalization is extremely high, and nobody wants tariffs. So the way I square those two views together is that, yeah, like, I think Americans have become much more anti-Chinese, but no, they don't want to pay more for their Christmas toys as a result of it. And by the way, they're right. The wisdom, and I know this is where we always disagree. In this particular case, I would say the median voter is right. The median voter understands that buying a toy from China does not fuel the Chinese Communist Party and its military machine.
Oh
It
yeah,
does not.
you and I agree here. Like, who started World War I? To your point, the munitions guys. It wasn't, the people in the upper levels of government. It wasn't these like people on the street who just want the cheap toys. Like, yeah, I'm with you.
But anyways, I think it's interesting. Ultimately, I think we're getting a deal. I don't think a war is starting like tomorrow. I also don't think this deal is a grand bargain. I think we both agree with that. When Trump meets with Xi in South Korea for this APEC summit, I think you should just expect a truce that does not last beyond probably the Trump administration. I think we're both in agreement on that.
Do you think World War III is inevitable?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think we need because I think we're going to stay in a multipolar world order for the next 50 years, maybe 20 years, maybe something in between. And I think that the biggest geopolitical story of the next 50 years or 20 years is not going to be China-U.S. tensions. I think it's going to be dissolution of Russia and the process by which its rotting carcass is pulled asunder across Eurasia by various other powers. So I think that what's going to be very interesting is that U.S. may be in a very good position, but for all the different reasons that a lot of people think, I think that the weakness of Russia. I mean, like, if the Ottoman Empire was the Eastern question and the sick man of Europe, and dominated European and global geopolitics for 100 years, it was really the weakness of Ottoman Empire. Can you imagine what the weakness of a country the size of Russia will mean for geopolitics? But I think we should spend a whole podcast just on that. I know there's other things we want to talk about.
Well,
but
no,
yeah, I don't think World War III is enough.
I shouldn't call you Norman Angle. I should call you you're McKinder now. The heartland is being torn asunder by all these different forces. By the way, while we were talking, the person who I'm meeting tomorrow for my AV check for my event, he texted me and said, "Hey, by the way, I'm in Milwaukee. Dodgers and Brewers are playing tonight, and the Dodgers are staying at the hotel. So if you see any Dodgers, that's what's going on. So I might see some Dodgers in the hotel. And if I see Freddie Freeman, or if I find out what room he's going to be in, I'm going to prank his room because he should have never left the Atlanta Braves. And I'm really, really butthurt that he decided to go to Los Angeles for the dollars. That was not very nice, Freddie. I had literally just bought your jersey after you won us the World Series. I'm really frustrated.
Dude, everybody goes to Los Angeles for the dollars. I did too. Like, come on. Give him a break. That's what you do.
And I went to New Orleans. Okay, so let's talk about Gen Z. I'm not going to be able to set you up quite as well as I could set you up for China, but we talked, I think in our last episode or episode before, we've had protests in Morocco, we've had protests in Indonesia, we've had a government change in Nepal. In the last 2 weeks, add two more basically coups to the list. So last week we add Peru to the list. President Dina Boluarte was taken out by Congress. Peru is I don't know if you can exactly call it a coup. There were some Gen Z protests 2 to 3 weeks ago, do you know what drove the protests in Peru, Marko? I did not until I started researching this. But do you know why the youth were so upset in Peru and why they hit the streets?
I don't think so, no.
There was a reform being proposed that would have forced self-employed workers to contribute to pension funds. And Peru, at least according to the OECD, aside from the fact that the young kids don't want to be contributing to pension funds, they have the 5th highest proportion of young people in the world who neither study nor work. And there's even an acronym for this. They're called NEETs, not in education, employment, or training.
Yep. I know that. Yes.
I didn't know that. There's 1.5 million of them in Peru. So you had all these protests a couple of weeks ago, and Congress basically removed the Peruvian president. Peru not a stranger to these things. There was it 22 or 23? I forget. A couple years ago, like Peru literally went through 3 presidents in
Yep.
the span of a month. It was incredible. Peru also like lots of different rare earths and copper and all sorts of other things. The Chinese are building up port infrastructure there. Like it's an important one. And then this week, I mean, nobody really cares about this, but Madagascar had a proper military coup. They had weeks of Gen Z protests around the country. And then, the president was basically toppled, I guess, earlier today. I mean, he's fled the country. The military has taken over. There's a special committee, everything else that goes along with a military coup. So that's at least, the two things that have happened in the last 2 weeks. But you said you wanted to cook on Gen Z. So I'll step aside and let you cook for a second.
No, well, I think you also wanted to last podcast, and actually it was prescient. Your spidey senses sensed this, and then we got another country where youth protests did this. So first thing I want to say is that this all really started in 2019, and me and my good Colombian friend Santiago, who I often cook and talk about. I remember we were looking at what was happening in 2019. 2018, 2019, you had Hong Kong protests, which were deeply violent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then we had Chile. Remember Chile, where the protests were actually launched because the transit fees went up by like quarter of a cent or
The
quarter
bus
of a
fees. Yeah.
yeah, bus fee. And what was interesting to me about those protests is that they were quite expansive. 2018 was, I think, Hong Kong. 2019 was Chile. Hong Kong protests were some of the most violent student protests I've ever seen. Like the kids were attacking police with hammers. And I think that one of the reasons that we in the West have not really realized how violent the Hong Kong protests were is because we had a very deep, that was the turn, that was the anti-China turn. The narrative about what was going on in Hong Kong was deeply, deeply anti-Chinese. And there was this view that the Hong Kong police was cracking down on protests. Like, first and foremost, you can go back and look at this. 2 people died in those protests. One fell off a parking garage. I think the other one died of a heart attack. Please fact check me on that.
Okay.
And the Hong Kong police was being assaulted by students who were wearing body armor and wielding machine tools. If you attack a bunch of ICE officers in like Chicago wearing body armor and a hammer, you're getting shot to death. And so it was very funny to me as somebody who lived in countries where there's actual protests, all these Western commentators talking about how, Chinese allied Hong Kong police was cracking down on students. I was like, guys, if you had the same protest in the US, there would be like 1,000 students dead. You got to be kidding me. So why do I bring this up? I bring this up because the Chile example of launching countrywide protests because of a small increase shows you that Gen Z has a very short fuse. Remember when like Spanish millennials camped in Madrid because youth unemployment was like 80%? So millennials, we clearly don't have a short fuse. We put up with a lot. Gen Z has a short fuse, number one, and two is much more violent. And that I don't need Madagascar or Nepal to teach me that. Hong Kong taught me that. Like kids in Hong Kong. And so why do I mention this? I mention this because I think the two generations are just much more different. I think that millennials kind of came of age, entered the labor force in a lot of the world after the great financial crisis. There was a lot of insecurity. There was a lot of sense of like, oh, you better shut up and enjoy that internship that doesn't pay you anything. You're lucky, and most of us did that. And part of the reason also is that most millennials also grew up in the middle of this globalized American hegemony world where if you just worked hard enough, you were going to do better than your parents. I mean, that was the narrative that still worked. We were the generation that realized that that's not necessarily true. Gen Z is coming behind us and saying like, you guys are suckers and you're weak. And we played a whole lot of Fortnite, buddy. So we're gonna put on.
And we haven't read books, so we don't know what happens when we protest. Is this your way of getting back at me for calling you Norman Engel? You're going to make me try and stick up for Gen Z here. I think you're being a little bit.
No, I'm being pro Gen Z. No, wait a minute. I'm not being anti Gen Z. I'm just saying, like, look, they have.
You said they had a very short fuse, and I might argue
for good reason. For good reason, though. I would say that a lot of us have been waiting for generational war. The reason it didn't happen is because millennials are basically suckers. That's what I'm saying. As a generation, they are,
Ah,
and Gen Z is not. You
so
know,
it's
so when I
it's
say the short fuse, like, yeah, I mean, they have a short fuse because they're going to stand up and fight for their stuff. And now, a lot of critics are going to say, and I actually, it's funny, Jacob, it's amazing that you wanted to talk about this topic last week because I've been talking about it to clients all week. You totally nailed it. And I just finished a great conversation with a client just before this call. And they said to me, but aren't you afraid that Gen Z is anti democratic? You know, because there's all these surveys that say that they're anti democratic. And like, look, I'm actually not that concerned about that. They see that democracy doesn't really work in many, many ways. And they see that it can be corrupted, it can be paid for. I mean, look, I mean, Donald Trump won on this platform as well. Like, democracy is not working for you. Like, you need to vote for someone who's anti establishment. It doesn't mean that Gen Z is going to replace democracy with fascism or communism. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means that there are certain things in our democracy, and democracy in Madagascar, certainly in democracy in Hong Kong or Chile, and certainly in my home country where I was born in Serbia, where students have been protesting for like 18 months as well, even before all these other protests. I think Gen Z is connected. They see what the rest of the world looks like. They see what countries without corruption look like, and they just, you know, they're kind of, a lot of these regimes are victims of their own success. They haven't delivered, aside from maybe economic growth, they haven't delivered on governance of quality of life. And Gen Z just, unlike millennials, Gen Z are not going to put up tents and occupy anything. They're going to burn it, and I respect them for that.
man, there's so much to break apart there. Okay. I don't think millennials are suckers. I think millennials came of age in an era, to your point, of optimism and believed that if they did the work, they would be rewarded for the work. And some of us woke up in 2001 on September 11th, and some of us woke up in 2008 with the financial crisis. And then COVID really like drove it home. That this was like not like you were not going to be guaranteed something that was better than your parents' generations. And I think millennials have had to cope with that because they grew up with this idea about the world, and the world that they're inheriting is actually very different. And the people that taught them that world are these boomers who won't step aside and keep on doing all these things. The world that, you know, we talked about this last time. I think you're right that like Gen Z grew up in a world that was fundamentally not optimistic, in a world where all of this was native to them, and where like this is all just sort of I don't know, like maybe in the same way that millennials are better with technology because we grew up with computers, even if they were shitty computers with MS-DOS and things like that. Like we at least know how computers work. Like we understand the basics. So if you give us a new cell phone, like okay, like it'll take us a couple hours, but we'll figure it out. Whereas a boomer, like once you take away a boomer's phone, like it's going to take them months if they're ever going to actually learn like the new phone architecture again. Maybe multipolarity is something that the Gen Zers learn. I don't know, but I think one thing I had a loss or a graduate student from Nepal on my podcast a couple weeks ago, and I was asking her, and she participated in the Gen Z protests in Nepal, and I was asking her perspective and why she participated. And one of the things that she alluded to was, look, because we're also interconnected, we see what's going
Yeah,
on in other countries.
big.
We see that in other countries things work and people have nice things. So like, you know, we already know like that we're not going to have better than our parents' generations. We saw what happened to the millennials, them believing that nonsense. And we also see that people in at least other countries, like things are better over there. So why can't we have those things? And we're going to go out and protest. And there is a part of this also where I don't know if you've seen those stats about, you know, Gen Z and reading and like their knowledge of like history or anything that came before them. It's just they're reading at shockingly low rates. So maybe they lack a requisite level of fear about what it means to go and burn something in the streets,
But
which
just
is I don't know.
let's
I'm
pause on,
grasping at straws there.
no, let's pause on those two because you know, that was one of the things I also said. It was this knowledge of the rest of the world that I think is very important. I think social media brings the rest of the world to you. And I think that that's very, very important because then you ask exactly those questions like, well, why isn't this better?
Yeah.
And I also think that, you know, it just is, travel has become cheap as well. And I think a lot of younger people have also managed to travel. And I know for a fact, like if you are from Serbia and you're in your 20s, you've probably traveled to Europe. It's not that expensive to do that. You have a phone and you can go to Croatia, which is next door. You can like drive to it. They basically speak the same language, and you're like, well, this place is better run than this place. Like, why? What's the difference? Oh, okay, yeah, they at least made an effort to clean up their governance to get into the EU, as an example. And I think that a lot of these regimes are also victims of their success. I mean, in Serbia's case, I made this point before. I think in many ways, um, Vucic and the people in power have managed to stabilize geopolitics of Serbia. It's actually one of the best performing economies in Europe. But the problem with that is that you've delivered jobs to the young people. You've let them travel. They all got enough money for an iPhone. But you can't then have governance of the 1980s or 70s. You can't just have these patronage. You just got to clean that up. I mean, that's just like you've created a problem for yourself, but actually delivering stability, and also by delivering economic growth. So I do think that interconnectedness, I think, is an important issue. Although I would say that millennials were also similarly interconnected. I mean, we were, even in our youth, we were able to see what's going on in the rest of the world. And again, that goes and speaks to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which started in Spain. Like, that whole Occupy movement began in Southern Europe, Spain, spread to other countries, ended up in U.S. And again, just to clarify the difference between millennials and Gen Z are willing to take it to the streets in a much more aggressive way than millennials were. And I think partly the reason is that if you're in your early 20s and you talk to someone in their early 40s, you would say, what did your peaceful protest get you? What did Occupy Wall Street actually do? And the final thing I would just say is, like, are they really ahistorical? Do they not know the danger of this? Or are they just young people?
Yeah, that's fair.
You
I
know,
always, no,
because
it's fair. I always actually shy away from generational arguments because I fundamentally think everybody's actually just the same, and all of these different tribes that we're putting ourselves
yeah,
into are just like it's false.
1968.
Yeah,
Listen, 1968 was an explosion of social movement in the world. Read it up, folks out there. It was global. Went like it was in America. It was about anti-Vietnam. In France, it was about the state of the education system and the rigidity of social norms. There was a sexual revolution going on. There was an anti-war revolution going on. There was an economic revolution going on. And the baby boomers had their moment in 18 where they blew up the world, right? And they were, in many ways, these were quite violent protests. I mean, Charles de Gaulle fled France to an army base in Germany where he was just hiding for like 2 days. The prime minister of France didn't know where he was.
yeah.
So this is what happened in 1968. This was the height of this baby boomer protest too. And I think it's unfair for a bunch of baby boomers now to say that Gen Z is undemocratic and they haven't read a book. It's like, bro, you were having sex and doing drugs at 18 and then tried to burn down the world and then sold out and, like
Well, no,
reversal.
and that's a good point. So, what was the geopolitical impact of 1968, and what do you think the geopolitical impact of this in 2025 will be, or will this just be like a paragraph in history books, such as they are 20 years from now? And amidst all of the different U.S. China blah 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 blah, there were these protests in these different countries all around the world demanding like lower bus
So
fares or whatever they're demanding.
so you know what? I think I'm going to make, when you were asking that question, I thought that was an unfair question. You know, but I think there was geopolitical relevance. In particular, if you think about the 1970s, there was um, there was like a detente in the 1970s, in part because all of these protests and made these countries and societies very inward looking.
Mm-hmm.
And you had to deal with the unruly baby boomers effectively. So I think that one of the things that we're all fixated on Russia versus West, China versus U.S., and we're thinking that this is going to dominate the next 10 years. Domestic politics could dominate the next 10 years. On the other hand, what I would also say about 1968, it did lead to the 70s, which were, yes, very domestically oriented decade, but very suboptimal from an economic perspective. So one of the ways that you dealt with those protests is that you just use Keynesian policies to satiate the public.
Mm.
So that could be also something that happens this time around. Although I think, in a weird way, I don't think Gen Z is necessarily asking for that.
No,
I think in some
because
cases,
they're all buying Bitcoin as I'm starting to join them.
They're all buying Bitcoin, but I also think that they understand that one of the reasons they don't have access is because of the patronage networks of the past. And also we did just go through a inflationary cycle in the West in 2022. So I'm not sure we're going to repeat that. I'm not sure, but I'm open to it. All I'm saying is that the 1968 protests forced the world to be a little bit more inward looking for the next decade at least.
Are you willing to? Do you think that that'll be the case as a result of the 2025 Gen Z protests, or have they not even congealed enough for you to put your neck out on
Look,
that?
look, Jacob. I mean, right now our examples are Serbia, Madagascar, Nepal,
Indonesia,
Peru. Okay, okay, fair. Hong Kong, Chile. Okay, in 2018-19. You know,
maybe some Turkey. Like Turkey has kind of popped its head up, and then Erdogan's gotten it under control.
I think we would need to see it happen in big developed markets. But one thing that I would say is that you don't need to use violence. Sometimes what happens is just political evolution. And one of the interesting conversations I just had with a client, they were asking me about what's going on in France and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that partly millennials and Gen Z, let's move away from protests, but I think millennials and Gen Z, they're just incapable of really connecting with some of these political parties that have been left over. Uh, and there's this idea. There's this idea that voters vote for their economic interests. We know that's not the case, right? So, what's the matter with Kansas? Great book. If you want to, it's very liberal critique of conservative politics of Kansas. So, if you're conservative, you're not going to like it. I think it's a well researched book by a journalist, Thomas Frank, who basically argues that people in Kansas vote against their economic interests.
Mm-hmm.
And then the book that kind of answers why people do that is Alexander Schussler, who is a political scientist who wrote the book A Logic of Expressive Choice. And that book is a far, far more complicated book to go through. But it's actually very good. Anyone who wants to kind of think about politics should read it. In that book, Schussler makes a very controversial argument that goes against decades of rational choice theory and says that nobody votes because of some sort of a rational reason.
Mm-hmm.
Mathematically, you have a higher probability of being hit by a bus on your way to the polls than impacting the vote. So why do you vote? That's the puzzle to him. Why do we even do it? Why do we even take the time out of our day to go vote? And his argument is that you vote for the same reason you choose Pepsi over Coke or Coke over Pepsi. It's because it says something about you. And he uses really interesting data and you know analogies to the marketing industry. For example, Pepsi tried for years, for decades, to use the taste test as a reason to get people to drink Pepsi over Coca-Cola. They would do these commercials, I think back in the 70s. I'm not even sure when, but like long time ago, they would say like 9 out of 10 people agree that Pepsi tastes better than Coke, in a blind test. And then once they decided to just do some silhouette of a person dancing to hip hop and call it the Pepsi generation, their sales went up.
Well,
Why?
started with the king of pop, Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson was the first one that got doing that, and that was also probably why he needed his first nose job, because he broke his nose on set. Fair listeners, used to be a Michael Jackson impersonator, so I know this history very well. I'm just,
I mean, dude,
dropping bombs there,
That's we need to unpack that. We need a whole podcast for that. And what was the other one? It was equestrian.
Oh, equestrian vaulting. Yes, I was also an accomplished equestrian vaulter. You all need to watch Marco's brain just literally spontaneously combusting. Well, it's not spontaneous because I caused it, but
no, it's just why you're a Renaissance man, and you have effectively Joe Johnson's game.
Oh, that's very nice. That's very nice.
I mean, this is like so. Look, what I'm getting at is that, to go back on track, but we will unpack this. We will not let you. This won't die. We will pick this up next podcast. I just want to land the plane on this. The point is, once Pepsi started saying that you do something when you drink a Coke, or you are saying to the world, I'm member of this new generation when I drink a Pepsi. Coke is for boomers or whatever. That's when their sales went up. Similarly, the reason that Donald Trump does well is because, yes, he's authentic, but he also understands branding and he's on brand. And I think one of the things that Gen Z and millennials just don't understand is the brand. Like Christian Democratic Union and a Social Democratic Party of Germany, holy crap. Those are old ass brands. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party,
Are old ass
very
brands.
old.
There's a reason Donald Trump was able to co-opt the Republicans and turn it into the Trump Party, and why a majority of Americans identify as independents, not as Republicans or Democrats.
Japan, LDP.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God, it's one of the longest running parties in Asia. Like a lot of these are just brands that, like nobody gets enthusiastic about. And so I would say that while we have spent a lot of time today talking about Gen Z protests, I do think that we need to be on the lookout for emergence of new brands, and we shouldn't fear them. There is this really, really built in, especially in finance. It's like, oh, God forbid a new party takes over. Listen, guys, material constraints will force them to do probably what's the right thing to do. But new brands are not necessarily a bad thing. Forza Italia is kind of an old brand that was taken over by Giorgio Meloni. And by the way, the brand is kind of fascist. Let's leave that aside.
Not kind of. Like, it's the OG. It's the original.
Yes. But the thing is, it's like this resurrection of old brands and bringing them back up and brushing them up for the new generation, I think is going to happen. And we should not panic when the CNNs of the world, the Guardians of the world, the Fox News of the world say anti-establishment party wins election in insert major economy. No, it's just that people got sick of these old brands and somebody else came in. Emmanuel Macron effectively did this in France, which, by the way, was a two-party state, whatever you want to say. They have a very similar electoral system. Anybody who thinks that first past the post in the United States of America will prevent the emergence of a third party should look at what happened in the United Kingdom with the Brexit Party, what's happening in the United Kingdom today with the complete collapse of the Tories, and what happened in France with the emergence of this third party. In France, the rebels were centrists. Now, he did appeal to a lot of older people, which is kind of weird, but let's leave that aside. Of course, he is a member of the establishment. He preserves their prerogatives. That makes sense. All I'm saying is that we should not necessarily fear the emergence of these new brands. I think it's healthy, and it's the only way to ultimately get buy-in democratically. And at the end of the day, who gives a fuck? Pepsi or Coke, it gives you caffeine and a sugar rush. And don't be fooled by these new anti-establishment politicians, because in many ways, they'll just do the same things, but appeal to the younger people. And that's how democracy kind of works. It works in those, like in a way in which new generations get a voice, and without changing the place in a dramatic fashion that obviously would introduce political volatility and violence.
I agree with most of that, and we'll close out because we're running up on time. Which is say, here's another theory, half in jest, about why Gen Z is doing protests, and it connects with something else. Earlier today, the United States hit another Venezuelan ship, killed 6 Venezuelan drug traffickers in the Caribbean. And Marko, maybe we should posit that what's going on is that this is what happens when you have an excess of cocaine in the global international trade system. Cocaine production rose 53%. From 22 to 23, 24% the year before that. I'm going to quote here a U.S. official who was anonymously quoted in the New York Times, quote, "We're seeing production at levels that Pablo Escobar dreamed about. You go to coca fields and it's like standing in a cornfield in Iowa. You can't see the end." And there are tons of interest articles here about Colombian towns and villages that are literally dying because the cartels are not showing up anymore because they have too much cocaine. They're literally just throwing cocaine everywhere they possibly can because the price has gone from something like $20 a bushel to $7 a bushel, which maybe some of our American farmers can believe it. So maybe there's just too much cocaine out there, Marko. I don't know.
So you're saying that the targeting of these boats reflects that?
Well, the targeting of the boats, I think, reflects the fact that they have too much cocaine and the cocaine is so much cheaper. So they're willing to risk. Like the Caribbean route was not their main route for the past couple of years or even decades. It was overland through Mexico. So now they're like, fuck it, we have all this cocaine. We just need to get cocaine to our markets in Europe and Asia, which is where the markets are actually growing the most. Like there is some growth in North America, but it seems like, Southeast Asia, East Asia, like Europe, that's where you're getting most of the cocaine consumption growth. We just need to get cocaine to those markets. And it's so cheap that whatever, if they blow up a couple cargoes in the middle of the Caribbean, that's fine. Like the United States isn't going to be able to blow all of it up. So let's just send as much cocaine as we possibly can out there. That's my working theory.
Well, look, I'm going to close on a positive note here.
Yeah.
You just said that European consumption of cocaine is going up, right?
Yes. Is it not? I thought it was.
I mean, there you go. Everybody thinks Europe is just a museum full of old people that has no future. I mean, not according to that stat. At least they're doing lines, Like maybe that will invigorate the continent.
Oh, I love this. I just double checked myself. Yes, cocaine consumption has been on an upward trend. An extensive study of wastewater across 128 European cities and 26 countries reveals a significant increase in cocaine use since 2016. And for the 7th year in a row, EU member states recorded record amounts.
Do they say exactly where?
Well, they say 128 cities and 26 countries, but the countries that they call out, which doesn't mean they're the top ones, but they call out Belgium, Netherlands. Oh, Belgium, Netherlands, and Spain account for 72% of the cocaine seized by governments. So that doesn't mean they're the ones that are doing the most, but those are at least the places where the governments are seizing it.
Yeah. Oh my God. I think that also needs a podcast by itself. But again, you hear a lot of this kind of narrative that Europe is sclerotic and just without any vigor. They took the advice and did some lines, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I'm only joking about Gen Z snorting a bunch of cocaine, but I did think, because I'm a little mystified by the U.S. continuing to just bomb boats in the Caribbean. I also just wanted to point out that last week the U.S. hit a boat that the Colombian government said, that wasn't Venezuelan, that was Colombian, and you killed Colombian citizens. And now the U.S.-Colombia relationship continues to unravel. Like very quietly, I think one of the most significant breakdowns in U.S. foreign policy. Like that was the most important U.S. security partner in South America. And between, God, it feels so long ago that Trump was tweeting at Petro about illegal migration. And they've signed on to Belt and Road, everything else. Oh, I'm sorry, one other statistic about cocaine that was incredible. I was doing research. They think that this will be the year that cocaine produces more revenue for the Colombian economy than oil. Insane, right?
Even though the prices have collapsed.
Yes.
Just think about that for a second. Oh my God. Yeah, that's
a lot of cocaine.
That's a lot of cocaine. Yeah. Well, I mean, wow. I don't know what to say about that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But
you were trying to land the plane, and I, in my LA Dodgers fashion, I was like, "Here's a cocaine curveball, Marko. I'm just going to lay this in right here."
No, you know what? I think the only way to land the plane on this is that this is probably what's going to happen with a lot of soft commodities, which you are an expert on.
Yeah.
As emerging market tastes change, right? Because the Southeast Asia and like the emerging markets, like starting to develop a taste for some Coke. I mean, that is also the same argument for coffee, for chocolates, for cocoa.
Yeah, and it's also, if I really want to stretch, it's also an argument against what you were talking about with globalization, because any of these things that get globalized, the price of these things collapses and the people that produce them come under significant strain. And I think part of Trump's protectionism and part of the glorification of hard labor and industrial work, again, which we talked about that months ago, about how strange it was that we're glorifying that now. Part of that is, okay, like the more you globalize, like, yes, we all get cheap widgets and all these other things, but like people actually, like the people who were making the things, their lives are destroyed. And these governments are not taking care of those people. And so you have political movements that are rising that service those people who are, out there in the streets and protesting and making their voices heard with votes. So there's something in there too about the lower you drive the cost of these things, the more you're affecting the producers, and that some of the politics that we're seeing is about trying to help the producers. I don't know, I'd have to put some more meat on that bone, but.
Well, all right. I think we have exhausted our energy on this podcast, and neither one of us is going to rely on a bump to get it back up.
No, that's never been my vice. Okay, we'll talk to you later.
However, if anybody wants to sponsor the podcast from the beer industry, we will drink beer on the show.
That would be great. And please, like both Barstool Sports and The Ringer, we're open. Like there's an opportunity for both of you to be on the ground floor of geopolitics, and you're both just wasting it. Like seriously, like get your shit together.
All right, Jacob.
Cheers.
Great talking to you, man.